Today on the Story Geeks Podcast, Caleb and I will be digging into the art of storytelling from a different angle, a little bit different than normal. We're actually going to talk about how to pitch creative projects. I'm Jay Shear, co-author of Death of a Bounty Hunter, a supernatural steampunk western, basically a weird western that's a semifinalist in Screencraft's cinematic book competition. And you know my co-host, here he is, Caleb Monroe, comic book writer, fiction writer, screenwriter of the feature film, The Mongolian Connection, amongst other things. What else? What are the other tags that you can tag?
I think that pretty much covers it. I sold a short story over the weekend, so we can.
Congratulations.
I don't know. Did we put prose writer in there?
Yeah, it's it. Yeah, the fiction writer was in there. Was it fiction?
There we go.
Okay, perfect. So, congratulations on that. Can you say who you sold it to?
It is for an anthology that I'm not sure I can talk about yet, but will be out in May, so very soon.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Yeah. I have, if you guys go way back into the old archive of Jay's projects, I had short stories in Infinite Space, Infinite God, and the sequel to that anthology. So you can go, if you're really curious, go way back into the day and look at those.
The deep dive
into yeah. And it's not that I wouldn't recommend those books. Those books are great, but it is a while ago that I wrote those. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So today we are going to talk about pitching creative projects to producers. And I wanted to start by just talking about our backgrounds, because our backgrounds as it comes to pitching projects are quite a bit different. So why don't you start, Caleb? What's your background with pitching projects?
My background involves mostly comics and movies. Comics, heavily weighted towards comics, some movie stuff, and short stories, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but those are kind of different. And part of what comes with comics is you're not always just pitching the creative project. So sometimes what I'm doing is pitching an idea to an artist so we can work together and then pitch it to a publisher. So there's various levels of pitching there. And then in my day job, building community for creatives in Los Angeles, there's a lot of pitching ideas to people, pitching to speakers that I would like to come, speak to the community. But by and large, comics, movies, short stories. Yeah,
that's good. And in my background, I haven't actually pitched a lot of creative projects because, as we've talked about numerous times on this show, the Reclamation Society produces the projects that I'm currently working on. So I'm the producer and the artist, the writer, in these kind of cases. So if anything, I'm pitching to myself. But as a producer, I do hear pitches from other people quite frequently, whether informal or formal. And we'll talk about what the difference is between an informal pitch and a formal pitch and all of those kinds of things. And then I actually used to be the overseer of a pitch program because I have a little bit of a background in tech startups. And in tech startups, pitching to investors is actually a really important part of getting resources to be able to build your tech startup from the ground up. And so I've studied pitching from like multiple different angles, but that one almost more than anything else. I've given advice on how to pitch to investors to over 100 different startups. I mean, because we had a program where all these startups would come through our program and we would try to help facilitate how to pitch to investors. And it is its own art form in a big way. And obviously not every lesson can be ported over from a business pitch into a creative pitch, but surprisingly a lot of them can. So that's, you're going to get very different experience. You're going to get Caleb's experience actually pitching creative projects and getting them sold. In fact, spoiler alert, at the end of this podcast, we get to go over some of his pitches, which means that if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, you should definitely check it out on YouTube because you'll be able to see some of the visuals that Caleb was using in those pitches as well. You can always find us on YouTube, The Art of Storytelling, the Story Geeks. And with that, I think we can just jump into some of the specifics of actually pitching. So I actually have another question here, but before we get to this question, one of the things that came up for me as I was thinking about this topic, and then it just came up as we were talking before the show, and like the 30 seconds we spent talking before the show, and even now, what occurred to me is that I didn't ask a question about how many formats pitches come in, but that's really kind of an important part of this conversation. So what are some of the formats that you have seen in regards to pitching? Like, I know in my career, I've seen elevator pitches, which are usually 30 seconds. You've got 3-minute pitches, 5-minute pitches, 20-minute pitches. I mean, a meeting where you're actually just spending time pitching and interacting with the people that you're pitching to, and that can be up to an hour or an hour and a half. So like, what are some of the areas that you've seen pitches occur? What kind of formats?
Well, part of what I'm going to show at the end when I show some of my pitches that have sold is how incredibly different all of them are. None of them are in the same format. None of them are the same length. A lot of it has to do with the situation and the relationship, like you said, or how much time there is. But I would say that it breaks down into maybe 3 broad categories. And I'm going to keep it broad, because there's so many places that will tell you, well, a treatment is 6 to 9 pages. An outline is this, a log line is this, a synopsis is this. Right. And I don't think any of that's necessarily helpful, because it's locking you into things that maybe are not right for this particular story.
That's a good
and I have another example that I did not write of it for a TV show that got created, of a pitch that's just doesn't follow any of those rules and still worked later to talk about later. But I would say it falls into verbal pitching, and that's face-to-face or over the phone or what have you. There's short form written pitches and long form written pitches. And short form, I'd say maybe 5 pages down to 1 sentence, and long form, 6 pages to 60-page treatment or outline for a screenplay for some people who write really, really detailed ones. And that all of these documents are not always pitches. So sometimes you write that 60-page screenplay outline because that is what's going to get you the next layer of the job. Maybe they're paying you to write an outline, but they will decide whether you write the script based on that. And then sometimes you have the job, and so you're really writing that for yourself, so that you know where all the pieces are going to be, and if you want to share it with your collaborator, so you all know that you're making the same thing. So on this scale from verbal to 1 sentence to we'll say 60 pages. That's not a number. Don't think like I gotta hit that number.
Right.
But just to show the breadth of it. On that scale, some of them may be pitches that are where you're trying to land work or land a project, which are 2 different things. Or you may have already landed it, and those same things can be your tools for telling the story the best way that you can, depending on what your personal process is, mechanic, muse. We've talked about a lot of variations in that.
Those come up all the time with us. We both have the same goal of getting where we want to get to, and we both have very different ways of getting there, which is awesome. Well, so let's jump into some of the other questions that I had planned, but I have one more question that I forgot to add into the notes, but we got a question, and I wish I could find the person who asked this question, but shout out to the person who asked this question, because it is actually a really good question that has come up with the Story Geeks in the past. And we got the question on Podbean. So there's a billion different ways to ask us questions. You can ask us on Facebook. You can ask us on Podbean. You can ask us on YouTube. This question came from Podbean. And again, like I said, I wish I could remember the name of the person who asked it. I know I'll look it up later and be like, oh, that's right. This guy asked, I have a great idea for a story, but I'm not a writer. What should I do? Should I try and sell the story to somebody? Should I try and collaborate with somebody? Like, how should that work its way out? And so I thought, what if we just started there from a pitch perspective? Because now you're sitting here and you're going, I have this really good idea, but now I need to pitch this idea to somebody. In this case, probably someone who's going to actually write it, or at least collaborate with this person as they write it. So
What would you do in that case? Not necessarily related to pitch, but a little bit related to pitch. What would your advice be to someone who has a story idea but may not be an actual writer?
So there's a wide variety of answers to this.
Yes.
I have noticed, and maybe you have as well, that whenever I say that I'm a writer, the person says, "Oh, I've got a great idea for a story." that this is a universal human thing, and we've talked about how storytelling is a universal human thing. So, and all of us have a story that stands out in our own mind and our own hearts that we would most like to see in the world, and some of us have more skills for executing that than others. Mm-hmm. But I would say, for anyone, try it yourself first. Because no one is going to be as passionate about it as you are. No one is going to want to tell that one story above all the other stories except you. So try it first yourself. The thing about writing is there's no, you can't screw it up. You sit down, you put some words on paper, and you show it to some people, and maybe it works for them and maybe it doesn't. And then that, by the way, holds true all the way through a professional writing career. Maybe it works for them and maybe it doesn't. And try it. Most of us go back to our, I don't know what number to say because the numbers are different on YouTube and the audio podcast. We'll be synced eventually. But one of our very first conversations, which is what is a story? And it's just an incredibly human thing. All of us are telling ourselves stories, about 1,400 a day, and little daydreams and problem solving things. And so just try it. Then if you decide that's not for you and you want to take another path, you have really two options, which is find a collaborator or hire someone. Yeah. You're going to have more luck with hiring someone, because of going back to what I was saying, no one is going to be as passionate about that story as you are. And the professional writers that you may know or maybe can get in touch with around you, or even just the people who are stronger in that skill set than you are, they all have one or two of those stories too, and they would much rather be working on that than on yours. And that's just the way the human mind and heart works. So, but they also all have to pay bills. And so consider, if you can, hiring someone, because that is a sort of a way to create passion within something. If you that maybe is not there naturally, or you can try to find someone who sees that vision that you see and they love it the way you love it, and they want to help put it into the world. And that is a harder process just because it's a relational process. And relationships are not speedy things. And a creative collaboration takes time. I have a friend, he's a film executive, and he says you can't make old friends overnight. And you just relationships take time. And so if that's the path you want to go, just know there's more time in that. And there's more relational investment versus the financial investment of hiring someone versus the time and effort investment of trying to write it yourself. Does that feel like that sort of covers the bases?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would say just a couple of additions to it, and then how it translates to pitching. So the first thing I would say is 100% agree. You should try it yourself. If you're a terrible writer, then it doesn't matter. Write as much of it as you possibly can, because if you're going to move to the point where you hire, let's say, an editor, first of all, I think it's much better to hire an editor and collaborate with another writer, because you're not going to be, the other writer will probably, by definition, if they don't get fully bought into your story, they're going to be constantly thinking of ways they would adapt it to be more passionate about it themselves, like you talked about. Same thing, right? So I would say, even if you're a terrible writer, terrible writers have sold things to producers. So get it down, write it down. If it's a great concept, if it's a concept that's going to be really something that people could sell, they will invest the resources in it to help you sell it. But I would start by writing it myself, just like you suggested as well. I would very rarely ever purchase writing services from somebody. I just don't think I would purchase editing services any day of the week. because editing is such a specific skill set. My wife is a professional editor, so I have the bonus of being able to get to work with her. But I would say get it on paper yourself first, even from copyright issues and things like that. Like, it's just better for you to get it on paper first. And then I would say collaborate with somebody if there's somebody else that's really passionate about the same story that you're trying to tell. And I would probably not pay that person except in royalties when you actually sell it to somebody, or whether you go to sell it yourself. And then finally, I would say definitely pay for an editor, because if you're the best writer in the world, you still need an editor. Sorry about it, but like, there's no writer in the world that doesn't need an editor. So,
yeah, or at least just a first reader, someone else who's good with language, who will just read the story and be like, yeah, you've got a logic hole right here, or I found three words that don't have spaces between them, things like that.
Yes,
it doesn't necessarily have to be an official position. I have a writer friend, and she is my first reader, and I try to be her first reader, although she's much more faithful at it than I am. I send something to her, and then based on her reaction, I know, oh, I've got to go back and work on it, or, oh, it's great, but she did point out like 5 typos or things that need to get fixed.
Oh yeah, and I'm all about having plenty of those kinds of people. Let me define what I mean by editor. I mean somebody that you're about to release the story to the world, and it needs to be in a place where people won't recognize. Every story is going to have errors in it. This is less important for screenplays than it is for works of fiction, which is primarily where I'm coming from. Prose, you're going to have an editor look at it in that context. But you should always have first, second, third, fourth, and fifth readers, in my opinion. Like, get as many people's eyes on it as possible. Totally agree with that.
A copywriter. And a copywriter who makes sure that the words are working correctly on the page.
Correct.
Which is one of my day jobs.
Nice.
And has served me well, and also in my writing career, just to constantly be, thinking in that way.
Yeah.
Versus a story editor, which sometimes you may also want to collaborate with, which is someone who's not necessarily writing the story, but they just have a great story mind, and they are helping you put it in the right shape and making it the best that it can be. And sometimes this is a professional position. Publishing companies have editors, and that is what they do. Comic book companies have editors, and that is what they do. But you can also find story editors to do that freelance, or you just may have a friend whose brain works that way.
Yeah, and as we talk about pitching, I'll come back to why I do it the way that I do it, and then we'll connect up some of those dots, because like you said, like sometimes some people won't need an editor because they're selling to a place that has editors, so you won't need an editor as much as I've just emphasized needing one. So it depends on where you're at in your process, and it depends on like how bad the writing is versus if it's not really that bad. So let me connect that question that we got from last week with this conversation that we're having now. The first person you pitch to is yourself. If you pitch to yourself and you're like, I'm a horrible writer, you just pitched a no go, right? Like, so why do you pitch to people? You pitch to people because you're hoping to cause them to act differently, publish something, pay you for something, collaborate with you. If you can't even sell yourself on it, then you're in big trouble. So make sure that when the first pitch is going to happen in this, it's going to occur in your brain, and you have to be confident in that. And then the reason why I like that question and tied it into the actual questions we're discussing this week, as opposed to like putting it at the end, is because if you say, okay, I'm going to pitch to myself, I can do this, but I really would love to have a collaborator. Guess what? You're pitching. You're going out to pitch to other writers to collaborate with you, and that's part of the whole deal. So, so with that in mind, now let's get even deeper.
One more thing that I realized I want to add as part of an answer to the gentleman's question.
Yes,
and that is, if you have an idea and you end up collaborating with someone or hiring someone to help you execute it.
Yeah.
These things are things that are so often done with like a handshake and just a verbal agreement. And most of the time it doesn't matter because most things don't get made. But every now and then something becomes huge, and then a dispute over who has the rights to the story and the script comes up. So just make a very simple one paragraph agreement that both of you are happy with, that both of you sign, that just says, here is how we're going to split up ownership of this, ownership of the copyright. Here's what responsibilities this person has and what responsibilities this person has. It's not very, like, you don't have to do a whole big complicated, but get that on paper and sign it, both of you. And it will, you will appreciate it later. And if you want a very visceral example, then just Google Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan copyright, because there is a giant, massive 30-year copyright dispute. And a judge recently just said, I don't know I can't find who should have this copyright. And so it's going to trial and a jury and all of these sort of things. And an ex-wife and his wife and multiple publishers are involved, and film studios, and it was never clear at any point exactly who had the rights. And so it's a mess, and just don't let that happen. It's very simple. Do that. And then secondly, I will also say something else to do is just tell the idea to some people. Sometimes the idea has enough juice on its own. Every now and then someone says an idea, and every writer who hears it just says, why didn't I think of that? Like it just shimmers, it sparkles. Yeah. And I've had, I don't know, maybe 2 ideas like that in my entire 30 years of writing, but sometimes that's enough. And so if you have an idea like that, then suddenly hiring people or collaborating with people or even just selling the idea becomes a lot easier. So tell it to some people and see what the reaction is. And if everyone is like, oh my gosh, I wish I had written that, or I can't wait to see that, then maybe you've got something. If no one seems to quite have that reaction, then it's probably what we would call what most stories are, which is execution dependent. Yeah. It depends on the execution.
Yeah. You probably could have sold Jurassic Park with like the log line, right? Like that's just such a great concept that there would be so many people that would want to get involved in that. And it could have gone a lot of different ways. Obviously, it went an amazing way, and it's now part of our cultural heritage in some ways, with the way we did CG and stuff. But that's a really, really good point. And it's a good segue too, because before we get into sort of more of the specifics of pitching, I wanted to see where you and I agree and differ on the 2 or 3 most important aspects of pitching. And as you were talking, I even made an additional note because it's really important to remember some things. So what would you
constantly say? You'll see me looking over here and either typing or writing. I'm doing that.
I know you have to, because you don't want to forget some certain things. So what in your mind, Caleb, what are the top 2 or 3 most important aspects of pitching?
So here's the 3 things I've decided, and I don't know, my opinion on this could change by the end of our conversation or by next week or by next month. Okay. But here's what I'm thinking initially. First is to understand that what you're really pitching is a relationship. You are, even if what you're pitching is a screenplay or a book or a comic, what you're really pitching is a relationship. Because if you pitch a brilliant idea, but it is just an absolute nightmare to be in the room with you for 2 minutes while you do it, no one's going to want the idea as good as it is, or they'll try to buy the idea and have someone else do it. Right. And what they're really looking for is confidence that you know what you're doing. That's relational. So even when it comes down to craft, they want confidence that you know what you're doing, and that's a relationship thing. So you want your pitch to just convey, I know how to tell stories. You should seriously consider me and or my project. And you're pitching that you're worth spending time with. If you're whether it's an email or a short conversation or a long conversation, if whoever it is ends up accepting your project, buying your project, collaborating with you on that project, like I said earlier, that's time intensive. They're going to be spending a lot of time with you, and they're always doing that math in their head. I'm going to be spending a lot of time with this person. Right. And the longer they've been doing this, the more that matters. Early on, they may be idea. It's okay. It's worth it. I'll just deal with the difficult creative. But after a while, there's a reason that difficult people's careers disappear, because after a while, people learn, no, I really, I want to find someone that I want to spend time with because this is such a huge chunk of my life. So I'd say first understand that what you're pitching is a relationship. And that you're not just pitching a relationship for this project. So when we get later, when I'm showing practical examples, you'll see, but most of the pitches that I've sold come from someone who I knew from some other context, or who I had pitched to before and not sold anything, or they had read something of mine and invited me to join the, like everything that you're pitching and creating, it's not about just this thing. Right. So many times you're going to pitch a story and maybe it's great but the publisher, something I've had a publisher say to me is, this isn't fascinating. We don't know who the audience would be or who to sell this to. But they still wanted to see more ideas. Yeah. And so there's a million reasons why your idea may not work for them. Only some of them have to do with the quality of your idea and your pitch. Yeah. So many of them have to do with how many pages do I have in this anthology? What would the budget of this project be? Who is the audience? Is that audience match with our company's audience? All, so many different things. So only a little bit of it has to do with less than you would think. Yeah. And even so, that's how writing works. And even outside of writing, 3 out of 4 jobs never get listed. So 3 out of 4 job openings at companies across the country never get listed because first they see if anyone knows anyone who might be good for it. Totally. And the ones that do get listed, I have a friend, he's a writer. He applied recently for a job as a film reviewer and found out afterwards that he was one of 40,000 applicants. Yeah. And so relationship is invaluable because otherwise you're one of 40,000, Exactly. But when someone emails you and they're like, hey, do you have any ideas for this or something? That's an entirely different conversation. And that's really the position you want to be in. So every chance that you get to show someone, you want them to have the idea that whether or not this pitch goes, whether or not this project works, this is somebody I want to keep in my mental file for future things. And I've had it happen multiple times where just no success with someone, but then a couple of years later, they're like, I think you'd be right for this. They had something that finally and they had kept me in mind. Yeah. And so I will actually, I don't know if I planned to, I don't know if I put this in my notes, but I'm going to say this right now. Yeah. When you go to panels at comic conventions or whatever, people ask you, how do I break in? Yeah. And I will tell you my formula for breaking in. Exclusive. This is exclusive. We need a horn to play. Yes. Bah, bah, bah. So step 1, make as many friends as you can. Nice. Not even in the creative world or the writing world or anyone at the company who can help you. Just make friends with people that you genuinely like and have things in common with. Yes. When I say friend, I mean friend, not like acquaintance and not networking, right? Whatever the term would be. Or people you're going to use at some point in time. Yes, that's not right. Just make as many friends as you can. Right. Write as many things as you can. Show the things you write to all your friends. And eventually something happens. Yeah. Like every major break I've had, the movie I wrote, writing Batman, my first professional comic, it was all a result of someone that I had a relationship with before. We were friends and they couldn't help me at all when we were friends. Like that, when we became friends, they weren't in that industry. They couldn't help me at all. But they happened later to be in a position and, the converse of this is that you need to be that friend to your friends. Yeah. Whenever you have an opportunity to help someone make a connection or to help put someone into a position or help their project succeed, do it. That's what real friendship is about. And this isn't about just, like filling up your contacts with people who you hope will one day be in a position. Because I've seen the unpaid intern become the editor-in-chief at comic companies within less than a year twice. Wow. So you may think like, I got a great relationship with an editor and that person may leave the company tomorrow. Yeah. But there are other times where you've for 5 years, I just hung out at a comic book shop with this person. And eventually we both ended up in the industry. We weren't, but that's not what our relationship was based on. So that's the formula. Make as many friends as you can, write as many things as you can, share all the things you write with all your friends, and look for opportunities to help them with their projects. That's it.
That's really good. And just really quick interjection to that, because one of the things I noticed, and I've had this conversation with other friends of mine, is that you will have a lot. This is just an observation that has been true that I've heard other people talk about, and I still think it's true. And you will have an easier time creating friendships if you're not desperate to get inside of a Hollywood bubble. There is a Hollywood bubble that does exist. The people in that bubble have been grinding for a very long period of time and are oftentimes very skeptical of people trying to break in because they realize how difficult it is. They don't necessarily want to spend a lot of their time if you're going to waste their time. And what I've noticed is that if you make friends outside that bubble, a lot of times it's people from other states. It's people who are amazing writers or amazing podcasters or amazing whatever. It's way easier. It's way easier to go farther faster with people when they are less skeptical and less dragged down by a system that is designed to eat people and spit them out. And there's people that are trying to change that in that system, and I understand that. But I just want to throw that out there as that's why
people move all the time. They change social situations all the time. They change jobs all the time. And this includes you.
Yeah. Exactly.
You may not be useful to anyone right now, but there are people who like you and love you. And because you like and love them, you're going to want to help them with things, and not even just writing things, whatever. You want to be there for your friends. And so that's anything that you would call relationship with a goal. Like trying to get inside the Hollywood bubble, that's networking, and that's not friendship.
Correct.
Friendship doesn't have a goal other than friendship.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's the best way of looking at it, because if you look at a lot of the people who take over systems for a period of time. Now, what do I mean when I say systems? We could call the film production in Hollywood a system. We could call the comic book companies systems. So what I mean by system is organization and process to get something accomplished. When you look at those systems, a lot of times a number of people rise up together in the system, right? Like this is just look back at like film history, and you look at people like George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola and that group of people all rising up at one point in time, right? And so because they have those types of relationships, they can refer projects to other people. I was listening to this. I think I might have told you about this. I was listening to a podcast, and David Fincher was talking to Aaron Sorkin, and they were talking about the trial of the Chicago 7 and how that got made. And as you hear them start to talk to one another, you realize they have, and Aaron Sorkin was being pretty humble about it too, because he's probably one of the greatest film and television writers of our era. And he was being very humble, but he was like, oh yeah, I got invited to Steven Spielberg's house. And that's like crazy, right? He admitted like that's a crazy thing to be invited to, but guess where he doesn't get invited to Steven Spielberg's house if he doesn't have a bunch of other connections, because he actually has true friendships, right? And so someone goes like, oh, so someone says to Steven Spielberg at some point in time, have you heard of Aaron Sorkin? I think he's looking to do something like this. You should talk to him. And all of a sudden you get an invite to show up at Steven Spielberg's house. I think it was on a Saturday morning. So like bizarre, right? Bizarre, but that's the kind of thing that.
And that's not always like a high level thing where the heads of something rise up together, although that happens all the time.
Yeah.
But for a personal example, I worked at a comic book shop for years and just behind the counter selling comics, I think 5 years.
Yeah.
And we hosted a podcast for a while in the back, just talking comics. My co-host on that podcast went on to become a big comic book writer, a comic book editor. Someone else that I worked with behind the counter went on to become an editor-in-chief at a comic book company. Yeah. We all kind of broke in at the same time.
Yep.
And we knew each other.
Yep.
And that is so invaluable. So I knew I could trust this person if they came to me and said, What do you think about this project? And vice versa. They knew they could trust me to deliver on something, or just come to me and say who would be good for this. And they knew that I wouldn't take it personally that they weren't asking me, because I probably understood why they weren't asking me for whatever reason, because of our relationship. You know what I mean? So like,
yes.
Trust is something that can't be manufactured. And so you'll see this happen often, where people who know each other and trust each other because they have years of history rise up together, because trust is an invaluable currency.
Yeah. So there's our mini podcast on how to break in. But
yes.
What can you recap your top 3, or if you have
we're still only on my first,
which
which is what you're really pitching as a relationship.
Cool.
That all of that falls under that.
Yeah.
Second, I would say the second most important reason is that it makes sure everyone is making the same project. There's a little written document that you and all your collaborators can say, oh yeah, this is what it is. This is what we're making. And it's that touch point, that reference. Okay, this is what we're all doing. Yes. That's invaluable. And then finally, I would say that pitching is an absolute clinic for finding the holes in your story.
Ooh, yes.
So you pitch it because you'll get to a point where you're like, I actually don't know what to put in this paragraph, or I don't know what to say next. Or they will ask you, they're like, well, what about X? What about Y? What about Z? And you'll realize, oh, okay. And that's okay, because this is the stage that you're at. You don't need to have a perfect execution. What you do is you have an idea. You're trying to put that idea into some shape and to get it into the world or the hands of people who can help you make it or want to buy it. And so this is the stage where you find those holes. This part of what this is for. And that has nothing to do with whether or not you sell your project, but it's one of the most valuable side effects, I would say, of the pitching process, is you will find the holes in your story.
I love it. I love all of those. In fact, they're very similar to mine. In fact, I'm going to say mine, and I'm just using different words for some of them. So hopefully some of the word sets will work for some people. And like, because I think in large part, we're saying some of the same things, and maybe even for some slightly different reasons that work for both sides. So really quick though, recap yours before I get to mine.
What you're really pitching is a relationship. It's helping you and all of your collaborators and or people who are hiring you know that you're making the same thing. And it's a clinic for finding the holes in your story. Love it.
So here's my 3. The first one is very, very, very similar to your first one, and that is understand the audience you're pitching to. So this is the mistake that I've seen dozens of people who are going to pitch make a huge mistake before the words even start coming out of their mouth, is that they think that they're that the objective of the pitch is the purpose of the pitch, because they want to get their thing made. And so therefore it is like, what do I do to get my thing made? And all of a sudden you just put yourself not in the mindset of a person who's pitching to someone else, like you said, to collaborate, to have a relationship with, but rather you're trying to sell a transaction to them. Horrible strategy. Don't try and sell transactions. Go to relationship, like you said. It's a much better thing. What you are trying to do is you're pitching to get the opportunity to collaborate. So what do your collaborators want and need, and how can you help them achieve that, right? Like that's what you're trying to do as you collaborate together. A lot of people just think, I want this done, so therefore I'm going to pitch thinking that I am the hero and I'm going to come and do this thing and it's going to be amazing and I accomplished my objective. No. You have a shared collaborative objective with whoever is going to produce your thing or publish your thing. So pitch knowing what the audience wants and needs. A ton of pitches fail because the person who's pitching walks into the room not having done any sort of research on the people they're pitching to, and just starts to pitch them an idea that will never go anywhere because those people don't produce those things. So you got to know who you're pitching to. That's like the number one thing. Don't go pitch a sci-fi horror book to someone who publishes romance. Like, that would be the stupidest thing. Like, here's my book, has no romance in it. It's about aliens and a horror story on a spaceship.
Although I would read a sci-fi horror romance. If anybody's got one of those, I'm all for it.
I bet you there's some that exist out there, and I bet you that there's someone who wants to produce those. But just know you're not going to walk into, the same publisher who's publishing. Well, I don't know. I'll refrain from saying that because I don't know. I don't actually know anything about the publisher, so I'll just scratch that from the record.
We'll just summarize and say not everyone is interested in everything.
Not everyone is interested in everything. Absolutely. In fact, for a large portion, when I grew up, I thought, okay, because I have Christian beliefs. I'm using quotation marks. There's so many different Christian beliefs now. Because I have Christian beliefs, I probably need to sell to Christian publishers. Guess what? There was not a marketplace in the 1990s and early 2000s for Christian science fiction or Christian weird westerns or Christian. That did not exist as a thing. There was no marketplace for that. You know what Christian marketplace wanted? Prairie romances is literally what they called them, and that's what the Christian marketplace wanted to publish. So Jay Shear showing up to a Christian publisher was a bad idea. It was a bad concept to begin with.
Time travel, horror, prairie romance.
Yeah,
I think we're getting somewhere.
we're getting somewhere. Now, I will say, this is my total aside. If you can't find a producer or a publisher who's interested at all, you can't find one anywhere that's interested in doing what you want to do, maybe that's a call to you to start your own production company, because I bet you can find other people who want those stories. It's just a matter of nobody out there knows what that marketplace looks like, and therefore they can't sell. So when you walk in and their objective is to sell prairie romances, and you walk in with a horror story, they're going to go, we don't know how, just like you said earlier, we don't have anybody to sell that to. Like, there's no audience there's no advantageous relationship that can be derived from this, because we can't help you sell more stories and you can't help us sell more stories. So this is going to go nowhere. So know your audience.
Yes. Real quick, knowing your audience, here's some great terms that a group of editors I know and have pitched to use, and that is reader cookies and reader anti-cookies. And what they mean by that is some things will just interest me in a story. Yeah. Like one of them, if there's a skeleton in the story, he's just more interested,
Yeah.
It's because it's just personally, that's just a thing he likes.
Yeah.
But you don't know what that is.
Right.
But then there's others who have anti-stories. You're pitching a story and maybe it's a really good fantasy.
Yeah.
But maybe what you don't realize is the person you're pitching to was the editor of a fantasy magazine for 15 years and just can't stand fantasy. And they know it's a good story, but they're just not interested.
Totally.
Or it's like, oh, there's a vampire. I'm not interested. I'm out. Like it could be the best vampire story ever written, but it's an anti-cookie for that person. And so part of what you have to understand is everyone has cookies and everyone has anti-cookies. You have them too. Yep. And so sometimes it has nothing to do with the quality of your thing. It's like, well, there's an anti-cookie in there or there's a cookie in there. Suddenly it gets attention because you had a skeleton in there. You didn't know that you were pitching to Skeleton Guy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's a very, very good example. Last thing I'm going to say about understanding the audience you're pitching to is that you have to keep in mind, and this is the note that I made while you were talking, because you were talking about copyright and like putting things on paper and having a contract and all those things. Keep in mind that the industry, so generally speaking, if you're going to pitch to someone, you're wanting to collaborate with them, you're wanting them to publish and or distribute your work that you want to work on. Keep in mind that you take on a certain amount of risk, but they also take on a certain amount of risk. And this is where the legal considerations of who owns copyright and who doesn't own copyright, this is where that originates from, is that both parties are taking on some sort of risk. But what a lot of beginner writers, I think, forget, and this is why it helps to sometimes put a producer hat on just to experience what it's like to be a producer, is the producer takes a lot more risk than a lot of writers realize. A lot of writers, they don't understand the business world. They don't understand how organizations work. And they think that company has a lot of money. Why can't they resource my great story? But at the end of the day, the producer has to say, I have to make money or at least break even on collaborating with a writer or a storyteller. So I can't just collaborate with anybody with any idea. So this happens to me all the time because the Reclamation Society is a tiny production company that does not have a lot of resources, and I squeeze as much out of those resources as I possibly can in order to get things released. I get pitches from people who are going like, usually very, very beginner people who are basically saying to me, hey, I got this idea and it's like this thing and it's that thing and it could be really cool and it'd be cool if you guys would produce it. And it's always kind of like, oh, did you have an audience? Oh no, like I just have this idea. Oh, okay. Do you have like some money that you're going to put towards it? No, I don't. I'm not really into that. I really just want to be creative. Like, yeah, so does everybody else on the face of the planet. Like, so you have to think about the risk that everyone is taking. And that is true across the board in any sort of business activity. Think about the risk that people are taking and make sure that when you develop your contracts that they're really fair. Make sure you're thinking about it as the writer, make sure you're thinking about it as the producer, and then proceed forward as such.
Just don't give anyone a contract that you wouldn't sign if you were them. People do that all the time. People write a contract that they would never sign, but they want the other person to sign it. But this is not going to work.
It's the golden rule, right? It's the golden rule. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Keep that in mind in your contract. So that was my number one, very similar to what you had said. My number two is also similar to one of the points that you brought up, and that is that pitching is in my mind a very iterative process. Okay, what do I mean by iterative? I mean that you can try and button up your pitch and have all your ducks in a row, and as soon as it comes out of your mouth and you see the reaction of the person you're pitching to, you realize, oh, that's not the way I should say that next time I say it. And so one of the things that helped a lot of the people that I've coached in terms of pitching, one of the biggest things that I provided them with was saying, you're free to go pitch to lots of different kinds of people. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but every time you do it, you should take notes away about who was this person, how did they react, why did they react the way that they reacted, and how would I change what I'm doing to better suit the needs of the people that I want to collaborate with. So it's a very iterative process that's going to take a lot of your time. You said it when you said you'll reach a paragraph and go, I don't know what I'm going to say in this paragraph, right? Like sometimes you should just go in with going like, I'm not sure what I'm going to say in this paragraph. We'll see how it comes out when I pitch it. And then maybe that's a point of conversation between you and the person you're pitching to. And they give you some great ideas that you can just take back and go, I'm going to change that whole paragraph because now it actually sounds better like this. So that's just something to think about as well, is that you should get in the habit of constantly pitching. Every time you meet somebody, you're in a conversation. Oh, hey, I got an idea. Let me run it by you. Boom, then boom, 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 boom. There's your pitch. Doesn't have to be formal. Can just be kind of fun. Don't take up someone's time that doesn't want to hear it, obviously. But
yes, where that's appropriate.
where it's appropriate, yeah. And by the way, with your friends who like what you like, it'll be appropriate frequently. Like you talked about working in the comic shop with those other guys. You guys are talking about stories all the time. So if you go, hey, I know you like that Walking Dead comic. I got a similar idea. Let me run it by you. Right? Like that's a pitch. That's a pitch right there. So yeah, definitely pitch over and over and over again. Final point, my number 3 point, use your storytelling acumen to pitch your story. And what do I mean by this? I'm going to give a very specific example. About when I was pitching a business, right? So, you would assume that when you're pitching a business to investors who will then invest in your business, you would assume that it's all dollar signs. Not true. It is not all dollar signs. One of the things that we recognized as we were pitching our business, and it's what I would call a very boring business for creative people, because it was essentially like machine learning and an algorithm for real estate agents. Boring, snooze fest for creative people. But what I realized when I would pitch is that we could answer any logical question and gain the confidence of the investor. However, until I engaged the investor with some sort of emotional response to the way that I was pitching, it didn't matter, because I could have all the best answers in the world for why it was the best idea possible. It didn't matter if I could not engage them emotionally. It is even more true on the creative side. No one wants to invest in you or collaborate with you if they're not getting emotionally engaged in your story. So when you pitch over and over and over again, look for that emotional response from the people you're pitching to, because that emotional response is what's going to lead them towards a yes. You can prevent a lot of no's by coming up with all this logic. But at the end of the day, if they're not emotionally into it and they go, yeah, they've got all their ducks in a row, but I'm just like, maybe there was an anti-cookie in there. Like, nah, there's a vampire, man. Like, I'm out. So just think about all of those kinds of things. And then finally, as you're doing your storytelling, I think, and we'll talk about this because we're going to get into the specifics of what a pitch might look like. I think it's really important in pitches to have things like target market, to have things like, if you can have even data. I know it's a creative pitch, but if you have data in there, like this is how many kinds of projects like this were sold last year. This is how much revenue those kinds of projects made. Here are the marketplaces that you can actually advertise this project to that will respond really favorable to them. That's all really good. But remember, if you don't have the emotional components in the storytelling, the pitch tells the story, engages them emotionally, and then they want to get behind it. So those are my three.
It's a good
any additional thoughts?
It's funny because we didn't even say we do 3. Oh, I guess we said 2 or 3. I was like, it's just we both had 3.
Yeah, it's too easy to do 3. All right, so now let's transition into, we've kind of given the big picture, and it took us 50 minutes to do that. That's how we are. We get into this. But now I want to break it down a little bit more. What are the core elements of a creative project pitch? Whether it's a screenplay, comic book series, book, whatever. What are some of the core elements that you took note of that you think should be included in a pitch?
Mm-hmm. The first thing I'll say is your pitch is a lighter, and what you're trying to do is light their imagination on fire. We talked about this in our previous episode where we were comparing different mediums, and so you can listen to that for more detail. But this is what you're trying to do: is you're trying to light their imagination on fire so that they see it and feel it and want there to be more.
Yeah,
that's so. Whatever techniques you're using, that is your goal.
Yeah.
So if you find yourself like following some how to pitch template and you're creating a boring document, then you have failed, because you're not going to light, even if you have a great idea, you're not going to light people's imaginations on fire. And so this is part of why, when I share a little later, you'll see that none of my pitches look the same pretty much, because part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to just read that situation and give them what they need. So you want it to light their imagination on fire. Secondly, clarity. There doesn't have to be clarity about every element of the story, but you want to convey that you know what the story is, and you know what your take is. And even if there's parts of the stories that aren't formed yet, that you are a person who will figure those out in a way that works. Yeah. So clarity. Next would be high points. You're giving them the high points. Do not so many people get into the weeds because they're like, oh, I spent a month figuring out what page 30 to page 45 we're going to be. I spent a month on it. And so it means so much to you, but nobody cares. Like it's the high points, the 2, 3, like this and this and this. And that's what makes it interesting. Just think about if you see a movie that you love and you tell a friend about it. Are you going to describe in excruciating detail like what an entire swath of the film is? Or are you just going to say, this part I loved and this really moved me and this was just so cool to see? That's what you're basically going to do, and that's what your pitch should do. Even if it's longer, it should basically say, this was super interesting, this is what moved me, and this was really cool to see. And ultimately, all of this goes under the way that I like to think most often about pitches is that you're trying to create the same effect with a different set of tools. So you want people to feel like they have you want people to feel at the end of your pitch the way that you want people to feel at the end of your movie or your comic or your story. but the tools to get there are going to be very different.
Yeah.
For one thing, maybe you've got 500 words of text and that's it. You don't have sound, you don't have actors, you don't have whatever it is. Your tools are different, but you're trying to create an experience. So start with the experience and then think, based on the tools I have, what are the best ways to convey that experience? Awesome. And a good metaphor for this is the poetry of Dante, the Divine Comedy. He wrote in Italian, and Italian as a language, has so many words that end with the same vowel. Or that can end with that sound depending on the verb tense and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So he rhymed the entire, just every line was a rhyme to another line in the entire Divine Comedy, which is not a short poem. But when translators try to do that in English, it's excruciating. Even good writers like Dorothy Sayers, she's a great writer, did a lot of amazing work, but her translation of Dante just grinds gears because she was trying to reproduce that same rhyme scheme in that same meter with a language that doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
English doesn't work that way. And so that's sort of the experience that you have. Do not give them an excruciatingly long poem to read that is just clunky and painful because you want it to, look or feel the same. Just know you've got different tools. You're using a different language. And so a different language requires a different approach and different ways of thinking. So that. And then just two other things that I'll throw in. And they're kind of the core elements of a pitch, but it's also just sort of varieties of pitch because some pitches are going to have different core elements. What I just explained is going to be most verbal and written pitches.
Okay.
But there are other times where all you're doing is pitching yourself, where there's already a project. I've gone in for comic projects. The project already exists. The creative team already exists. They just want to know if I have an interesting take and would be the right person to execute that. Or you can listen to our earlier episode talking with my co-writer and the director of the Mongolian Connection, talking about the first time that we met. Yeah. And he shared some of what he was thinking and looking for, and I shared some of what I was thinking and looking for. Even though I technically was the one who was up for the job, I also had things that I was looking for from him.
Yes.
And we were that first time that we met at El Compadre and just had Mexican food, and it was our first conversation ever. What we're really pitching is ourselves to each other. Like, is this going to work? And then the other variation is the short story markets, where you don't pitch short stories, you just send the story, and it's got short in the name. So there it is. A lot of short stories are shorter than pitch documents or outlines that people will write poems.
Right.
But that's a whole different type of pitch where you're essentially pitching a finished product, and you're saying, here is the story. Do you want it?
Yeah. And
so those are a couple of variations, but most of what I was talking about there, it's going to cover most of your written and most of your verbal pitches.
Nice. Yeah. And the list I have will either be in the pitch itself or will be implied. And so this is what's really, this is what I love about podcasting with Caleb, is that Caleb just gave you a lot of these philosophical concepts, and then what I made an actual list of things, include this. So that's why I like collaborating, because if you just listen to me, you might actually get them wrong because you didn't get the philosophy behind why they're in there. So this is good. I have several that I'm going to run by you. The first is a concept. So every pitch should have a concept. This concept, a really good definition of a concept is from Carl Iglesias's book, Writing for Emotional Impact. I'm holding it up on the video, but you can check it out. I'm sure you can get a copy on Amazon. I think I got a used copy. But he says a concept, and what I mean by concept is the part of the story that describes what the story is basically about and what's going to happen in the story. And we're talking about very short 1 to 2 sentence things here. But he says that a concept should be uniquely familiar and promise conflict. Uniquely familiar is a very interesting thing to unpack, because unique and familiar are very odd words to combine.
But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. People want something that is familiar to them. A producer, for example, you might say, wants something that's familiar to them, like we talked about, know your audience, know what they make already, but is unique. They haven't really seen anything just like it before. So, for example, in your case, if the producer produces, they produce horror films, but are sick and tired of vampires, well, then the familiarity of your project is going to be something probably having to do with horror, but it's going to have a unique monster or creature or a scary thing that maybe the producer hasn't seen recently. So there you go. That's uniquely familiar. And then also promise conflict. So that should be part of your pitch, is this concept of what you're going to accomplish with the story. Your characters, I actually recently heard a TV guy, I wish I could remember his name, but he very articulately said, lately in my pitches, I spend a lot of time just talking about my characters. And that's how important characters are to, well, particularly TV, where people are going to follow these characters for an extended period of time over the course of a series.
It matters way more in TV because it's not the premise. I think like the first 5 episodes of Vampire Diaries actually had diaries in it, and like people voiced over as people wrote in their diaries. But that show went for like 8 years, and no one had diaries even by the end of the first season. So it's the characters.
Yeah, and when people talk about, especially in television, but when people talk about stories, they don't usually tend, unless it's like a real high concept thing like time travel, they don't usually tend to talk about that. I mean, I gave an example of time travel where they probably would, but a lot of genres, they're actually more so talking about the characters. Very true of television, but if you think of across all of the other platforms, a lot of times people will go straight to characters because that's how they relate to stories. They see themselves in them or see their friends in them, and guess what? Those are the characters on the screen. So concept, characters, your authority. We've both talked a lot about this already, but I want to really paint a picture for this. You've said this numerous times, is that people are going to invest their time and effort and energy into you. So you have to have a certain amount of authority behind the thing that you are going to do. Authority can look like a lot of different types of things. Authority can look like the people who you've collaborated with in the past. If certain people have so much authority that it's not even funny. They can just walk into a room and then everyone goes, I would trust this person to do this. But even if Aaron Sorkin walked into a room and made the statement, guys, guess what? I'm gonna write the amazing sequel to the Vampire Diaries. A lot of people in that room would go, oh, does Aaron Sorkin have the authority to do that? Of course, he's an amazing writer.
Money for an Aaron Sorkin Vampire Diaries. I would give you all my money for that.
Yes, that would be amazing. But the point is that has he had success in that area before? This is going back into like writers will change. Some writers, especially in the prose world, will change or write under a pseudonym because they don't want what they've written before tracking with them to the next project. They could say, I've written a bunch of spy thrillers and they've been amazing, but now I'm going to go write a romance. And guess what? I don't want to carry the baggage of being famous for spy thrillers because that's not going to help me with the next audience that I'm going to write. So I'm going to change my pseudonym. Either way, what you have to bring to the table is, why should I trust you to write a romance? Right? Like, and then you got to have some reason or rationale behind that. So things like I enter a lot of, or not a lot, but I enter contests for books. Death of a Bounty Hunter, I'm entering in contests now. I don't do that so I can get the prize at the end of the contest, because usually those don't matter to me as much, right? Why do I do that? Because if it gets somewhere, if it makes it into some level of the competition that is meaningful, now I have authority the next time I go and talk to someone. Someone else has said, and this is how people operate, right? If your friend has told me that you are a trustworthy person in this regard, then I'm more likely to trust you, right? Without having ever worked with you before. And so that can build your authority. Have you been in contests? Have you done well in contests? That can help you build your authority.
Let me give you a practical example.
Perfect.
So in 2008, I got hired for my first professional comics job, which was writing this mini series called The Remnant.
Nice.
And Comic-Con came up, and the hope had been to have a first issue ready for Comic-Con because it would get opportunities for signings and all of that sort of stuff. That didn't happen. But what the publisher did do is they made an ash can, which is half the size of a normal comic. And it had the cover of the first issue, the first 4 pages of the first issue, and some character sketches and a little bit of like, here's what the story is. There was almost, there was not really much meat on those bones. Right. And it was this little thing, but it had their logo on it. It was Boom Studios. So it's like, here's a professional company. They make things. And that was the first time at Comic-Con that any editor I went up to, I could hand them that, and then they'd be willing to hear from me.
Yes.
Before it was always just sort of like you were like a supplicant, like, and they're like, well, who are you? And even though they didn't know who I was, they're like, oh, someone else thinks he's worth paying.
Exactly.
Right. So I'll have a conversation with him. I'll take an email from him, and nothing specific necessarily always came out of those, but it's just suddenly people were willing to have that conversation because I had this little thing with a logo on it. It was obvious that someone was paying me to make something. So very practical example. Perfect example.
So we've got concept, characters, authority, your authority. And then the other thing I would say is that you should always include your target audience. Now, it depends on the pitch. Sometimes if you're just doing an elevator pitch or you're doing a really short pitch, you don't need to explain the target audience for the thing. That's not a big deal. But a lot of longer pitches, you're going to want to describe what the target audience for the thing actually is.
Do we need to define elevator pitch just in case people don't know what that means?
Yeah, good point. Elevator pitch means a pitch that you could deliver in the time it took you to travel in an elevator. So that usually say about 30 seconds. This is an elevator pitch. This is what I'm working on. Would you define it any different than that?
No, just imagine yourself getting on an elevator and there's the person and you've got to tell them, you're just telling them the idea before they get off of their floor.
Yeah.
It's very, very simple.
Yeah. And I found that even in some elevator pitches, saying what your target market is actually really valuable, because imagine that you're going to pitch to someone in an elevator, but you're not actually pitching to them to be an audience of yours, nor are you pitching to them to invest in your particular story, but you're just trying to give them an idea of who you are in a short period of time. You might actually bring a target audience into an elevator pitch, because you might say, oh, I write weird Westerns for people who love science fiction, fantasy, and comic books. I sometimes will say something like that in an elevator, because what I want the person who's standing next to me to realize is you're not in my target audience. I can tell by looking at you that you have no interest in the thing that I'm going to do. What I would like you to know, though, is that I'm very passionate about this thing. It matters to me a lot, and I've done it before. And so that just might trigger for them in the future. They're not trying, because what people will do when you pitch to them is they will inherently try and figure out, should I do something? That's what, whenever you pitch to somebody, they're always thinking that, would I buy this story? Would I produce this story? Would I refer you to somebody else? So if I know that this person's not going to be my audience and they're not going to produce one of my stories, they're not going to read one of my stories, they're not going to produce one of my stories, I'm thinking maybe at some point in time, they'll run across somebody who they will say, oh, you should talk to Jay because he produces or he does stuff like this. And so you can use your target audience to actually tell people, this is really valuable, actually. You can use your explanation of your target market to alleviate their stress of having to make a decision that is an investment decision and actually take it into a referral relational decision, because you know you don't want them investing in you and you know that they're not in your target market from an audience standpoint. So using your target audience can be very effective. Number one pro tip, anytime you think about your target audience, is that it is probably people who are similar to you. So you can oftentimes describe some of what made you so passionate for the story you're telling. And that will almost always define who your target market is outside of that. So just pro tip. It's very rare that you write something that is just that you care nothing about, but other people care about a lot. Like that's just, it's even very dicey, because it's like, is this even going to be a good story for them? I mean, that's a risk I wouldn't want to take, right? So if you don't like it and you're trying to sell it to people who do, if you're the guy who doesn't like vampires and you're writing a vampire story, I'm like, I don't think I want to produce that, because the people who like what you don't like are going to probably be like, I kind of feel like this guy doesn't like vampires, So anyways, let me continue on here. Any competitive advantages you bring to the table
should probably make your way into the pitch, especially the longer pitches. If you have, and by the way, this is like not lying to them about it, but actual competitive advantages that you have. That could look like experience. It could look like, for example, if you're trying to pitch to a publisher and you've already self-published your book and you've sold 2,000 copies of it already, you can say, I sold 2,000 copies on my own. Imagine what you could do with it, right? So that's a competitive advantage, because if they're looking at 2 different pitches and they're like, we're only going to choose one pitch. Well, this guy's already proven that he can sell books. This one, I don't know. He hasn't sold anything yet. So things like that, competitive advantages, these things in Hollywood can be celebrity attachments, people who have already said that they're engaged. Think of how many people have sold pitches to Hollywood because they said, oh yeah, guess what, my buddy Bradley Cooper says he's going to be in it, and he's actually signed a contract already. These are the kinds of things that are competitive advantages for you. And by the way, Bradley Cooper is not my buddy, so I can never complain. I can never claim that. So this is a good one for you. I only have 2 more left. This is a good one for you. A collaborative spirit. If you don't approach the room with a collaborative spirit, then chances are you're going to come off wrong. I've heard people pitch their businesses acting like their business is the best possible business of all time. And then what this does is, if you don't come in with a collaborative spirit, if you come in with like a prideful spirit, the people on the other side of the table go, this person doesn't appear to need any help from me, right? It's an instant turnoff. Why would I invest money in this person? It seems like they've got everything together. So definitely come with a sense of humility that you need them to make this a reality, or you need someone like them to make this a reality, and you're hoping that it's a fit. Yeah.
So, and sometimes they'll ask a little question. They'll give you a suggestion on the story, and they're not even really making a suggestion.
Yeah.
They just want to see if you're like, oh, that's interesting. You know what we could do with that? Or if you're like, no.
Right, exactly. Yeah, change my amazing story with that dumb idea? I don't think so. Okay, you're not getting hired for that, right? That's a really good example. The final thing. I think that you should have an idea, and if you need to study this in more detail, then you need to study it in more detail before you pitch. But have an idea of what the producer is hoping to get out of it. Have an idea of why they would want to collaborate with you, from a numbers standpoint, from a perception standpoint, from a, all of the above. I mean, again, we're in such a competitive environment when it comes to storytelling that maybe your pitch needs to highlight the fact that you are working with some other writers who are more diverse than you are. And that's something that is perceptibly wrong with the producer you're pitching to, because they don't have a lot of diversity in their depths. And so they're thinking, oh, actually, yeah, we would like to have a new vampire story. And if you're bringing that to the table, that actually helps us in the long run. So yeah, that'd be awesome. You're bringing new voices in. Let's do this. So things like that, like what is the producer going to get out of it, is an important thing too. And this is just all part of collaboration, is that you get something out of it and they get something out of it. And it's beneficial for everybody. So I have a short break we can take before we get into the rest of our conversation about pitching. But anything you want to say before we jump into the break?
No, I think this is a good place to pause.
Perfect. So let me play a quick clip of the audiobook trailer for Nathan Sheck and my novel Death of a Bounty Hunter, and let's take a listen to that. I'm going to remove Caleb and I from the stream and go ahead and play it.
From the co-writers of the Amazon top-selling serial story, Timeslingers, comes a new, full-cast audiobook, Death of a Bounty Hunter, a supernatural steampunk western. 14 different characters voiced by 11 professional voice performers. A Korean bounty hunter named Flint finds himself in the middle of an occult plot to steal a powerful relic from an innocent woman.
Get me the Iron Spur, and I will show you true power.
Caught between the desperate sheriff who's becoming unhinged at the worst possible time.
He mutters the word like a curse dipped in sarcasm. I draw my gun and shoot him between the eyes.
And the phantom woman haunting his nightmares.
The living always think the dead are worse off.
Flint will have to make a choice, confront the sheriff's posse of misfits or run. But he's losing time. An ogre of a man with a Gatling gun for an arm. The brash and headstrong Pinkerton agent, Geraldine Abernathy. And a young, speedster idiot ludicrously named Fancy Dude. They'll all converge at the home of a widow who's lost everything but possesses the relic they all desire, the Iron Spur.
Damn that trinket to hell. I don't care what it is or what it does or why the Duskfinders want it. I care about my children.
Death of a Bounty Hunter. The weird western you've been waiting for. Available on www.deathofabountyhunter.com.
All right, we were back. I know that Caleb might get really tired of listening to that trailer over the course of time, but if you think you're interested in it, then definitely visit deathofabountyhunter.com for more info. And by the way, buying Nathan and I's novel is actually a great way to support this show. You can also donate monthly on Patreon or join the Story Geeks Facebook group. So check out all of those things in the description down below. And another way to support this show is to support Caleb. So check out his projects at calebmonroe.com. More information on all of those is available in the description down below. Well, Caleb, should we continue to talk about pitching and how to pitch?
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. So let me ask this next question. What do people include? And we've already touched on some of these things, but I really want to nail down some of the things that people do incorrectly. What do people include in their pitches that really has no business being there?
So the main thing is too much. People can always ask you for more on an idea. They can't ask you for less. And this is what the same editors that I got the term reader cookie from, they call it the author problem. Yeah. You care about every part of your story. Yeah. You're the author. But most people do not want to hear the details of how the person goes through this scene and then they meet this person and then that's not an interesting way to tell a story. In your head, it's interesting because you spent so much time on it and you have all the context and you have all the details and you know how it ties to everything else in the story. But to most people, it's not interesting. So what most people include is too much. I would say, see if you can include half or 2/3 of the information you have in it, and they can ask you for more. Knowing your story well is important, and they can tell if they ask you a question and you've got answers for it. They're like, okay, but like I went back to, you're sort of sharing, this is what's interesting, this is what was emotionally arresting, and this was what was cool to look at. You're kind of doing that, not getting into the details and the mechanics of the story. In most pitches, sometimes they're going to want a big, long 30-page mechanics of the story, but usually they've already heard the short version that interested them before that comes along. And so basically what you're doing is you're saying, here's the premise, not here's the plot. Here's the premise, and here's why it's sexy.
Yeah.
And then, they will ask questions about the plot if they want to know more about that, but don't start there. And then the other thing I would say that people include that really has no business being there is some sort of expectation for how this is going to go. Particularly,
that's a good one. That's a great one.
Particularly the expectation, like, this is it, I'm going to break in. Or, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
totally.
First of all, breaking in is a complete fallacy. There is no such thing as breaking in where suddenly you're on the other side of a wall and now you're cool. When you're writing, every job ends. Every book, every screenplay, every comic, it's a finite job, and getting the next one always involves some kind of pitching. And even as a professional, you're going to get way more no's than yeses. Yeah. So there is no like, I've made it. Here's the next project. That's all it's ever going to be for the rest of your career if you're a writer. And your job is just relating to people, pitching stories and executing them until it isn't. Yeah. Until you've tried it for a while and no one is interested anymore, or maybe, or whatever it is. And maybe you decide you'd rather be doing something else, whatever. That's your job until it isn't. There is no, I've made it. But we can carry all sorts of expectations in there. Like you can have an expectation because this person has made movies that have had a certain impact on me. I'm probably going to feel this way about them, or we're going to have this kind of connection. And a lot of times you're like, I can't believe this person made those things. Like it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like they're the person who would make that.
Right.
And so many ways that we carry expectations in, and so leave all your expectations at the door.
That's awesome. Okay, so those are you had two of them to throw in there then.
Yeah,
perfect.
Just too much.
Yeah.
People include too much, especially story details and plot. And people have a lot of expectations, and it's just not the place for them.
I love those two. Those are two fantastic things. I've got three of them. The first one is do not include bad research or bad numbers. Now, I realize a lot of creative projects may not go to numbers at all, but there are some creative projects that numbers might be a really good idea for you, right? For example, I'll give you an example. When I pitch the Reclamation Society, which is our nonprofit company that produces this podcast, amongst other things, and our books, when I pitch it, I have to speak to a lot of people who are not inherently science fiction, fantasy, or comic book fans. And one of the things that I need to do is I need to prove how big that marketplace is, because they think to themselves like, oh yeah, like I know maybe like 2 or 3 people who are like geeks, and like, so you're going to go, what are you going to do? Talk to them? And what I do is I actually have a whole slide where I go, did you know that over the last 5 years, 9 or 10 of the top grossing movies from those years are actually considered within our audience, meaning there's a lot more geeks out there than you might imagine, right? And so there's numbers, but if you have bad numbers, if you didn't research your facts and figures very well, if you walk into a room and a lot of times those people, the executives, they know the numbers very well. If you have bad numbers and you walk into a room and you quote those numbers and those numbers are bad, you're an idiot. You've lost all authority. The rest of your pitch, it doesn't matter how great it is, it will probably fall on deaf ears, because they would go, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's a really bad thing to go into projects with. I've seen it happen numerous times. If you've got a fact in your mind about the way something works, keep in mind, people have smartphones. I've literally seen as teams have pitched to investors, I've literally seen investors Google something and go, you're 100% wrong about that, because that's not true. So just make sure that you do your research. Don't say something unless you've researched it really, really well. By the way, those things are also an opportunity. Is if you have researched it really, really well, that's a really good opportunity for you to take a confrontation and turn it into a team up. Because you can say, oh, I'm really glad you brought up that fact and that figure, because if you look at it from this other direction, so now what did you do right in that moment? You made yourself the expert, because you said, oh, I'm aware of that fact and that figure, but let me give you more detail into why I gave my fact and my figure, and then that becomes a discussion that we can have, as opposed to now you look better, but just make sure you know what you're talking about. Second thing, that should never be in any of the pitches that you do. Do not use superlatives. Do not use superlatives. You're not doing the best project that they've ever seen. You don't have the best concept that they have ever seen. Approach your pitch with humility. Approach your pitch with humility. Let them say this is the best pitch that I've ever heard. Let your audience say this is the best movie that I've ever seen. But do not include those kinds of superlatives. Superlative just meaning the ultimate positive description of something, or the ultimate negative description of something either. Leave those out of your pitch entirely.
I would say, however, believe them. Just don't say them.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like, they want to hire the person who thinks this is the best idea ever to execute that idea. And they want to see your enthusiasm and your excitement. They just don't want you to tell them that they should be the same enthusiastic and excited. But they want to see that you believe it is the best. Yep. And they can tell if you're not very interested, or if you're like, this would be a pretty good,
Oh, that's a really good point. So that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought up that distinction. Is that what I'm not saying is that you should go in not believing in yourself. What I am saying is go in with a mindset of humility and be passionate, but be humble. And that's like the best possible combination for your personal mindset to be in. That's a really good clarification.
Final thing. Do not ever include. People have sold projects based on this, but I think this hurts your integrity. I think this hurts your authenticity, which is a long-term detriment to you. Do not put in your pitch false promises or outright lies. You know, if Bradley Cooper is not tied to your project, don't say that he is. Just because he met you at a bar somewhere and went, that's kind of cool. You know, like that's not do not include false promises or outright lies, because those will be found out over time. People will go, I mean, and if they're not found out right away, because people have lied in a bunch of pitches and been successful, it will catch up to you over time, right? So don't get in the habit now. There's no reason to do that. So with that in mind, those are the things you should leave out of your pitches. What do people actually leave out of their pitches that ends up being a big mistake? In other words, they should have included it in their pitches.
Mm-hmm. Tone, atmosphere, and feeling is the first thing.
Good. Yeah.
You do not want your pitch to feel like a map or an instruction manual. You want to create a tone. It needs to feel like something. Nice. People leave that out because they're worried about the mechanics. They're like, do I explain what the obstacles are? Do I introduce the character the correct way? Have I given enough information about this? And because all of your language is about conveying information, your pitch is boring. Make sure that you're including language that it evokes something, tone and atmosphere, feeling. And the second thing that I would say that people leave out that they need to put in, and it's for basically the same reasons, is themselves. So many times you'll see someone and they just Googled Aaron Sorkin pitch, took a pitch document of his that they found, and then they stuck their story in it. And but that works for him and that particular story that he was pitching. That does not mean it works for you and your story. And why, let's just say you're pitching to a big studio. They can go get Aaron Sorkin for the Aaron Sorkin version of this. Right. Like what about you makes it a project that should be done with you? And so tone and yourself are the two main things that people leave out, your personality. And so towards this, I'm just going to read a little bit of Lena Dunham's pitch for the TV show Girls. Successful HBO TV show. I think it went for 6 seasons. I'm going to read you the first paragraph or two and then just skip down to the end. But no, it's only 1 page long. Nice. So this was the pitch for a TV show. It was 1 page long. Sex and the City depicted women who had mastered their careers and were now being driven crazy by the tick of their biological clocks. Gossip Girl is about losing your virginity and gaining popularity in a world where no one is old enough to vote or has to worry about making a living. But between adolescence and adulthood is an uncomfortable middle ground when women are ejected from college and into a world with neither glamour nor structure. The resulting period of flux is heartbreaking and hilarious and way too human. It's humbling and it's sexy and it's ripe for laughs. Products of the recession, these girls are overeducated and underemployed, sure that they're too smart for their positions as assistants, nannies, and waitresses, but not necessarily motivated enough to prove it or even do their jobs well enough to advance. They have that mix of know-it-all entitlement and scathing self-deprecation that is the mark of all great Jewish comedians and many 24-year-old women with liberal arts degrees. So that's the opening, and then I'll just skip down to the end.
And by the way, immediately funny. Like it immediately engaged you in like humor and like, oh, that's true. How crazy. So uniquely familiar.
Yep. They are navigating the transition out of college level codependence on their girlfriends, but will still call to announce that they got their period or saw a man masturbating on the subway or saw a man who looks sort of like a kid they went to camp with. Could it be him? And if so, is he on Facebook? They're beautiful and maddening. They're self-aware and self-obsessed. They're your girlfriends and daughters and sisters and employees. They're my friends, and I've never seen them on TV. So you can Google this. You can find the pitch. It's 1 page long, and it's all that. It's all tone and Lena Dunham's personality. There's not a character or a plot point in the entire thing. But people knew what they were getting. And she had made a movie at that point, and they could go and look at her film if they wanted to. But also, she was pitching in a way that someone who had made a film like that like you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like this is because her first film, I believe, was very atmospheric in tone. It was, it was not a super plot oriented type of thing. But so many times people are like, well, I've got to have this plot point. I got to make sure I got to get all my characters in there. And now it is the exception that proves the rule. I'm not saying do this, but just know that there are pitches that work that have no characters and no plot points in them. And where it comes down to decide how much of that to include is what kind of feeling are you trying to evoke, and how are you conveying your personality, and what the story will be like coming from your fingers versus anyone else's.
I love that, because what she basically did was she used the creative imaginations of the people she was pitching to draw up the environment, the characters, and the scenarios without having to, with just hinting at them. And so basically you can create that show in your mind in a matter of minutes if you've ever been around anybody that's in that career period of time. To give a weird and funny story about that, this is the kind of thing that would happen in that show. My co-founders and I were walking around San Francisco. We were right around the corner from Twitter, and this group of really young people comes walking around the corner, and it's led by like two young girls that would fit perfectly into this description. I call them girls; they're women, just young women. Let's put it that way. I don't want to be too much of a chauvinist over here. And then behind them is a group of total programmer nerds. Right, like, and it looks like they're walking right out of this script, and literally, one girl goes, "I'm hungry," and the other one goes, "I'm bored," and that was like to me that was a comedic moment. I just started laughing because I'm like, how does someone respond to "I'm hungry" with "I'm bored" when you're literally in the middle of San Francisco and you work for Twitter? Like, how is that even a response? Like, that doesn't even make any sense unless you just that Lena Dunham's pitch just evoked that mentality, right? It's like these two were probably overeducated and incapable of doing more than they were currently being assigned at work, which is probably why she was bored. And why would you ever respond to "I'm hungry" with "I'm bored"? But that's kind of what she just drew out, right?
Well, and this goes back to what one of the first things I said, which is the point of a pitch is to light their imagination on fire.
Exactly.
And this is an excellent example of that, because Jay is telling you personal stories from his life that were evoked by less than a page of
exactly.
Yep. She lit our imaginations on fire.
Exactly.
And that's what you're trying to do.
And that is what my reaction, the reason why I reacted that way is you're like, dude, why are you telling a story about this random experience you had in San Francisco? It is because that's exactly the response you want to have from someone you're pitching to. Oh, that's cool. I know exactly who you're talking about, and I would love to see a show about them. Because what did I do? I used her humor to come up with a story that I thought was really funny. So the producer thinks of a story that's really funny in their life and goes, "This will work because I've actually seen it. I've experienced it, and it's funny." So I think that's really, really, really good. Really good. Anything else for
Nope. Those are, okay. I want to keep that part like really focused. Put more tone in and put more of yourself in there.
I love those. I love them. So to your point, my first one on here is people bring the wrong mindset to the pitch. That's actually the first line I have, which is basically what you were saying in different words and more complexity. One of the ways that you should think about producing or pitching, and this doesn't come from me. This comes from someone else. And again, I can't give credit to them because I can't remember who they were. But I've studied pitching for so long that I don't remember where I get all of these things. A lot of people will enter the pitch, and this is when a lot of times when you sound too proudful. A lot of people will enter the pitch thinking that they are the hero. I'm the hero. I'm the hero of making these producers a lot of money. I'm the hero of making this business a lot of money. Therefore, invest in me and you will be rich. It turns out that when you pitch to other people, you are not the hero. You are not the hero of this story, the pitch being the story. You yourself are the guide
and they are the heroes. Now, why are they the heroes? Because in this story, you cannot do what you want to get done by yourself or to the degree which it could have an impact without them. So who's the hero? It's not you. They're the heroes. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, so what Lena Dunham is trying to say, for example, is, yeah, I could go do this, but it won't have the same impact as it would have if you guys did it with me. So you guys are my heroes. See this population of people who look like me and help me create a show for them that they will love. And then the producers go, oh yeah, we'd love to be that hero. Let's do it. And so that's how you can kind of get into that state of humility, is to say, I am a guide who can show the hero how to react and how to respond in such a way that it creates a really cool thing, right? Whatever that thing looks like. And that's one of the mindset tweaks that I would highly recommend. It changes a lot of pitches from the ground up when you start thinking about it that way. I think the other thing that I would highly recommend in 2021 for pitches, and this changes a lot over time, depending on how desperate studios or publishers are for material. Right now, there's so much material out there that there's not a lot of desperation. So I would say you should give evidence of how other people can have reacted or responded, right? If you have, like I said earlier, if you've self-published something and you're going to a major publisher because you want to see if you can expand the reach of your project, of your book in this case, then go with reviews. Here are some of the reviews that we've actually gotten before, and then list some of the most powerful ones. There is a certain thing of when you present evidence that an audience loves what it is that you're doing, it starts to remove the risk barriers from the people you're pitching to, because they're looking at it from a risk perspective. If we invest in this, will we be able to break even? Will we be able to make money off of it? Will we have an impact on society? Insert whatever result the investor or the producer or the publisher wants to achieve, and then help them understand that you have not been sitting idly by to wait for someone else to become your hero and save you, but rather they are just helping you achieve not only your goal but their own goal, and that's how they become the heroes. And so you've iterated, you've tried things, I would say, don't say, I just showed this to Caleb yesterday and he loved it. Like that's not enough. That's not enough evidence, right? They're going to be like, that doesn't seem like you've gotten far enough. So don't use like one other or two other examples, but say, in the 6 months, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out who our target audience was. For the first 3 months, we sold no books because we didn't know who the target audience was. But you'll notice in month 4, we changed our language. We changed the way we were talking about it, and our sales went and they spiked. And now we've sold 2,000 copies. And if you look at the people we're selling to in our new target market, they really love it. And now what you've done is you've helped them solve one of the problems that they have, which is, who do we sell it to and how is it going to do and in the market? And you've removed some of those barriers that may prevent them from saying no. So compelling stories or evidence about what you've done is my second point. And my third point is, remember to use storytelling hooks that engage producers, publishers, investors. Use those storytelling hooks to engage them emotionally, which is exactly what Lena Dunham did, right? Like she used all of these things to engage people emotionally. Like literally, there are people who probably laughed out loud after those first 2 paragraphs and went like, that's hilarious. And if you can get that kind of response, then you are on a really, really good path. Because even if they won't produce it, they might be on the lookout for people who would. And that's what's really cool too. You've talked about that before. Okay, well, I'm excited about the next portion of this show because we're actually going to have Caleb show us some of his pitches. He and I will try to describe those so that, because we're going to show them on the screen. He and I will try to describe some of them as well, just so that those listening on audio can get a full picture of what he's showing. But if you want to watch this on YouTube, basically go look for the Art of Storytelling, the Story Geeks on YouTube, and look for this specific podcast. And then we're about 1 hour and 40 minutes in now. So if you want to look at the pitches specifically, then go check that out on YouTube. Caleb, take it away, sir.
Yes, and I will say, but before we start, I'm mostly showing these because, with a couple exceptions, these are stories that worked. I got hired to do them, or they got made, or whatever it is. But also part of why I'm showing you is because none of them look the same. And so I'm going to be talking about context more than like how things are structured on the page, because you'll see there is no standard. And I may never use any of these formats ever again. So don't think that it's like, here's a format for a pitch. Here is just, I'm going to talk to you about the thinking. This is why this pitch is like this. This is why this pitch is like this. This is the context in which I was pitching it. And so even if you're only listening to audio, most of that should still come across without necessarily seeing them.
Awesome.
So let me share. Here we go. Great.
Nice.
So I'm going to start with a pitch for a comic called Peacemongers. This is actually the comic.
Can you make that a little bigger, Caleb? Can you increase the size on the page? Is that possible? There you go. Yeah, now we're talking. Cool.
It's called Peacemongers, and it is the comic about which an editor said, we have no idea who we would sell this to. and so this is more of a classic formal pitch. This is the type of things that creative writing programs teach you how to pitch, because this is us pitching. It was me and an artist saying, here is a thing. We want you to make it. Let us pitch it to you. Okay. There wasn't any pre-existing anything going on there. So, but the top, it gives the title. It says it's for a 4-issue miniseries. It gives the names of myself and my artist collaborator and some of our credits. Then it says the concept, which is a 2-sentence version of the story. Then it's got a picture of the characters. Then it's the story, which is a 2-paragraph expansion of the concept. And then on the next page, again, some more character descriptions. Some more character designs. These are in black and white. And then we just say, here's the genre, here's the theme, here's the relevance, here's the visuals, and here's who the fan base would be. That's all. That's half a page. And then it just goes to the first 5 pages of the comic. And that's it. That was the whole pitch. It's basically just saying, this is it. This is the book. Here's what it looks like. Here's how it reads. And it's like vital statistics. So the whole thing is 8 pages long, but 5 of that is just the first 5 pages of the book.
And let me just comment on this as a producer of things. Let me just comment why I really like this. What you've done here. One, you start with your concept, which I think is really important. By the way, Lena Dunham started with the anti-concept of like, this is not what it is, but let me get to where I'm going with what it is, which is awesome. I love the fact that you've got the illustrations on there, because comic books are such an important visual medium that you can instantly see like this is very compelling art. The other thing that I really like about this is that you put the fan base in there. And because you put the fan base in there, I think that what it does for me as a producer is it goes, is that in alignment with some of the other things that I'm producing now? And like because you have Sergio Leone in there, I'm like, oh, fascinating. That I would not have thought that looking at the art right off the bat. But because you put it in there, now I'm more intrigued about it. Like, how would this be something that Sergio Leone fans would like? So really, really good job on that. I like that a lot. And then of course the art speaks for itself after that.
Yes. And the visuals, there's 2 sentences about visuals right before that. It says, this is high fantasy horror with the pace and feel of a Western set against a sprawling setting reminiscent of the Mongolian steppes. Non-standard period costumes, also zombie demons. So
perfect.
Very quickly saying like, boom, here's some of the cool things about the way it's going to look. And then I said, for fans of Conan, Sergio Leone, Finder, and March, which are all very, very different projects, but they all share something in common with it. And at this point, they've already read the synopsis, they've read the concept, the theme, so they can start making those connections themselves.
And one of the things that you are doing here, which I've mentioned several times, but this is a good example of be iterative in your pitch. In other words, you could have pitched this story having no visuals yet, but as you developed visuals and worked with an artist, now you're including them. I'm already working on this. I'm already passionate about it. Look at the iteration that we've already gone through. And I think that that's really important, is to show forward progress when you pitch. I think it's really, really cool. So great job.
Yeah. So next, These are Peanuts pitches. For a while there, I was writing Peanuts, and Peanuts was an anthology series. So you would pitch stories, and then they would accept the ones they accepted and reject the ones they rejected, and then you would write the script. It didn't matter. It had just, you wrote it till it was done. There was not a page count, and then they would take these different page lengths of stories and assemble them into issues that were the same length. So you never knew exactly which issue your stories were going to be in. I'm just giving you that as the context.
Yeah.
And I'm showing you this because this is, so the first one is you're showing something to a publisher. This one, a publisher has already enlisted me to pitch to the licensor, the person who actually owns Peanuts, or their representative, the studio. And they are the ones who are making the call. This story, yes. This story, no. This story, if you change this,
Right.
Those were basically the 3 reactions. So this here, I'm like, here's some 1 to 3 page stories. And then I've got an idea for one. I got an idea for one. And I've got an idea for one. That's a page and a half between about half a page for each of those. Oh, and here's a 4th one. And then I say 6 to 9 pages, and I pitch a longer one. And that actually ended up being 14 pages. And I'd say all but one of these stories actually ended up becoming a comic.
Wow, that's awesome.
But what is interesting, okay. I meant to show you Ice Age first, but what you'll see, I'm comparing this with Ice Age, but what you'll see is how much dialogue there is in this. So Lucy's Loophole, there's only, I don't know, if you put it all together, it'd be 4 lines of description, but it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of dialogue. And that is because if you read Peanuts comic strips, it's all it's like people say things. It's there's not a ton of action. It's people talking. And so giving people confidence that what this comic is going to feel and look and sound like, in this case involved, you have to show them the dialogue. This is the joke. These are the punchlines. Here's how it all ties together.
Well, and let me just say is that this is my point of knowing your audience, because you already know the people who have enlisted me to write have confidence in my writing. Now, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to build confidence in the licensor. The licensor probably knows that you're not doing the art. So the art is going to come out looking like a Peanuts comic, right? There's no question about, you don't need to describe the scenarios, and the
licensor actually was the studio that did the art. So, or they did a lot of the art. So they knew it was going to look right.
They knew what it was going to look like. So by you putting the punchlines in, you're basically saying, look, you've already created the environment. I'm not messing with the environment. All I'm doing is presenting you with evidence that I understand the characters, right? And so that's perfect. That's a perfect way of doing that.
All the dialogue that was in that story, like the entire thing.
Cool.
Okay, and then so next, this is, oops, where did it go? Ice Age.
Can you make this one bigger too, just so we can see it a little closer? Perfect.
So Ice Age, again, the publisher had already wanted me to pitch for this project, and I was pitching essentially to Fox.
Got it.
Because they are the licensor. They own everything.
Okay.
And it was originally going to be a 24-page one-shot. It ended up being 5 24-page one-shots. But part of what I knew going in is the pages were going to be square, not normal comic shapes, so that they could be sold with kids books in bookstores with comics, and that that every story was going to be self-contained. So I knew that. So here I just pitched 5 ideas, and each of them is just a couple paragraphs long. 1, 2, 3, 4 ideas. And in this one case, actually the first 2 became the first 2 issues.
No way. Cool.
But there's 2 pitches here that didn't land. And most of the time I was like, for the final one, I wrote 5 pitches. One of them went. There's 4 ideas that they're on the cutting room floor. And in this case, half these pitches are on the cutting room floor. You have to know that that's part of what's happening. Is that you are giving them options, and they're going to choose their options, and you just have to be okay with the fact that most of the options aren't getting chosen. I've got 4 pitches here and I know only one is going to be this one issue. In one case,
can I ask you a question about this real quick? Were your favorites the ones they picked, or were your favorites some of the ones that hit the cutting room floor?
I actually wouldn't send them anything that I wouldn't have a lot of fun writing.
Okay, cool.
So I'm approaching it from different angles, but all of these are something I would be excited to dive into.
Nice.
And I'll also point out here in the first one, this is the one that became the first issue of the Ice Age comic, that I have a paragraph that just says, hilarity, of course, ensues. Because they know why the situation is funny. It's their characters. Yeah. And I know why the situation is funny. Like, I've given them the premise, and then I'm saying, and of course, there's going to be all sorts of hijinks. Yeah. But going back to what we were saying earlier in the author problem, I'm not describing the plot. This happens, and this happens, and this happens. Yeah. I basically, most of the comic gets summarized in those 4 words. Hilarity, of course, ensues. Mm-hmm. But they know that the publisher thinks I'm the right writer for this. And they're looking at multiple ideas, and they're seeing that I understand the characters, and I've given them a premise that they can understand. Okay, this is going to work, and so that worked.
Excellent.
So, Mike, the reason I wanted to compare this to Peanuts is you'll notice there's no dialogue in these.
Right.
The pitches are the same length, but no dialogue. I'm just saying what's happening in the book, because Peanuts is a very dialogue. So much of the execution of Peanuts is people talking. So much of the execution of Ice Age is visuals, because these are big screen movies. There are definitely characters, and I describe characters doing things those characters would do, but I'm also just sort of giving them situations and things that will look cool and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So let's see what's next. Okay, this one. So this is a trailer. And this is for readers. This is a comic that a friend and I were going to do two friends and I were going to do as a Kickstarter. It never came together, but we basically put together a 4-page trailer with art and lettering and all of that were never going to be in the comic. So this, unlike the other one, which is here's the first 5 pages of the comic, here's 4 pages of comic. This just to show you, this is a trailer. We want you to feel it. And so we've got 4 panels on the first page, and it just says the heist, the score, the cop, the family, and it has an image to go with each of those. The second page, we never got drawn, but it also just said the thief, the general, the killer, and the double cross. So we've introduced these 8 elements: heist, the score, the cop, the family, the thief, the general, the killer, the double cross. And you can get a sense just from that what type of story we're talking about here. Each of them has a visual to go with it. And then the last 2 pages were just a double page splash. And it just looks cool. It's got all the characters on it. It's got the title, and it's got a tagline. So double, you only get 1 shot to make a second chance count. And so I'm including that because that's pitching to readers in your audience. I'm not using that. We weren't using that to pitch to a publisher or a licensor or anything like that. That's for pitching to readers.
And that's very cool too, because basically what you've done is you've given the vibe. Like, I can tell you right now that is, if you are a fan of The Losers, for example, then you're in the same market that you would say that this comic book is in. Like, if you like The Losers, you'll probably like our comic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you'll see with comics. So I just showed you 2 comics pictures that had visuals, and that's because they were being pitched to people who were not necessarily involved yet, a publisher or readers. And visuals are so important to getting someone involved in your comic. But the other 2 pitches were just words, because the publisher was already doing the book. I was already, the writer. And so this was more about like finding the right execution.
Yeah.
So this is a pitch that you'll see at the top, it just says 12 miniseries pitches. And then I had 12 pitches, and the one I'm going to read you is 2 sentences long. And it's just pitch number 3. Number 3, revision. On the worst day of his life, a man finds a gun that, instead of firing bullets, can rewrite anyone's life story. Each issue is a bullet from that gun, rewriting the issue before it. And that was it. This is a publisher I have a relationship with, and I just sent them 12 of those, just to see if any of them sparked any interest with them. And that was the one they're like, I would like to see some more about that. And so I turned it into a 2,000 word treatment. And I wrote this pitch not really knowing how I was going to pull that off. Each issue is a bullet from that gun, rewriting the issue before that. Like, that's a pretty ambitious thing to say. And I put it down in a few words, but I was going to have to pull that off. And so then I wrote a 2,000 word. So then I had to sit down and figure out how that actually worked. And I wrote something longer. But this, again, is just, I'm showing you this because this is pitching to someone I have a relationship with.
Yes.
It's an editor I've worked with before, at a company I've worked with before, and it's just sort of I don't want to waste their time. They know the kind of things they would get from me based on these ideas because I've written in different genres, and so I'm just like, is this idea interest? This idea interest? This idea interest? I said 12, and going back to cutting room floor, 11 of them apparently didn't interest, and that's fine. But I've got those story ideas around always. So next is Batman. This is the pitch.
And by the way, let me comment on that one really quick too, from a producer standpoint. What you have written down there is an ideal elevator room pitch, right? Or it's just, I say elevator pitch. I don't know why I said room. Elevator pitch. It is a short statement that is full of intrigue, and you're sitting there going like, oh wow, that's a really compelling. It is reminiscent of things like Memento, and it's reminiscent of things like Inception, or even Groundhog's Day, depending on which way you want to take it. And is this kind of feeling of like, oh, you're going to be playing with time and space on a page or in the reader's mind about what that will look like. And I think it's really cool. So that was a really good example of an elevator pitch that you might use if you just had a few seconds to get that request of, can you send me more information about that? Because that sounds really cool. Like, that's a great version of that.
And I should say, in the background, something else that's being pitched there. Now, again, this is a relationship, so I can do that. But part of what's being pitched is like, you know what? I got a lot of ideas right now, guys. Like, let's get something going. That's part of what's happening, because they might not have been interested in any of them, but they said, like, obviously he's got a lot of ideas. Maybe let's ask him, see if he's got any more. And so sometimes you'll be in a situation where really what you're pitching is the fact, like, you know what, I can give you 12 viable ideas. Yeah. I'm not just like a one-trick pony. And that, again, is part of pitching yourself. So this next one, this is the pitch that became my one and only Batman story written for DC Comics. Now, this was so unlike the other one, which was pitching to a publisher I had a relationship with. This was a specific invitation. An editor from DC reached out to me and said, are you interested in writing a 10-page Batman story? Can you send me some pitches? And basically, I had to send them the pitches that night. By the next morning, they had picked one. I had to write the script that night. By the next morning, they gave me notes, and I had to rewrite it that night so that the artist could draw it in time.
Wow.
So it was a very fast turnaround. So I sent them 3 pitches. This one's, I think, 5 paragraphs long for a 10-page story. And this is basically the exact story. Each of these paragraphs is roughly probably 2 pages of the comic, right down to the exact ending line of dialogue. There is some dialogue, but it's written in prose form. And what's interesting is I sent the first 2 pitches assuming those would probably be one of the ones they picked. Because I was trying not to get involved a lot in continuity. I was not trying to create new characters or whatever. But this one was an idea I liked, so I threw it in as just a what the hell. I'll throw this in too. And this is the one they picked. But I create a new Bat villain in this, and I'm working with continuity. Almost all my notes had to do with continuity. They're like, well, that character and that character and that character are going to have to be replaced by other types of characters, those sort of things. Because I used a lot of characters with short appearances. But again, so I threw it in. I'm like, what the hell? Why not? I like this idea. And that's the one they picked. So I thought the other 2 were more likely, but this one was the one they liked. And this became a 10-page Batman story. And really, the story didn't change much from this at all. So that's an example of pitching to someone who has invited pitches. So then this is the pitch that got me my first paid comic job, which was writing a book called The Remnant. And it was based on a treatment by Stephen Baldwin and Andrew Cosby. Most people probably recognize the name Baldwin. Andrew Cosby, he created the show Eureka, and he wrote the most recent Hellboy movie, just to give you context. Okay. So they had a treatment, and they were looking to hire someone to turn this into a 4-issue comic series. So I was invited to do this by someone who knew me before they were an editor. And thought I might be a good fit for it. And so I pitched, it's a 4-page document, and each page is it's the exact page, almost exactly full, and each page is an issue. So I'm pitching a 4-issue thing. It's a 4-page, 1 page per issue. And this pitch did not get used at all. Almost none of this. They're like, that story doesn't work for these reasons. But they saw that I was a writer who could execute and tie together a story in a good way, and they saw something in there they liked about what I was doing. So I got the job, and then they had me write a whole different breakdown that actually
that's cool.
Well, there's so many plot elements in here that just never ever showed up in the final comic. In fact, 80% of this, and the 20% that stayed is the 20% that I took from the original treatment. So pretty much everything I added
nice.
It was not working. It didn't fit their picture of what the book was going to be, but it showed that I could do it. And it was enough that they were willing to take a chance on me, and that they liked how that turned out. And they gave me a second book based on that. And another editor at another company liked what I did with this one and brought me in to do something similar on a project of theirs. And that was how my whole career began. And all of it was with a pitch that didn't work, to be honest. Like the information in the pitch did not work. It was apparently they saw that I could do it, and they liked the angles or way I was approaching things and the way I was describing things, but it's just none of the content actually made it to the comic.
Right, which is a point you've made before, which is, and a point that I've made before, which is you might not actually get hired based on the content you produce, but you showcase that you have the authority, and you showcase that you understand the world that you're writing in which case they have increased confidence in you.
Yes. And so next, we're almost at the end here, but this one is, this was my pitch. I was already writing. This was for Steve and Mrs. Pio, which was going to be a 1-year season 1 of comics. There didn't end up being a season 2, but we wrote the whole year of comics. And I had already been hired to co-write issues 1 through 3 with Mark Waid, who was a very established comic book writer, and he had come up with a take. Here's how we're going to approach this property. He had written out a treatment for those first 3 issues. And I was hired to turn those into 3 issues of comics, so similar to that project I just showed you. But then I was going to take over the series and write the rest of it myself. And so this is me pitching the entire year, the entire season of here's what it's all going to look like. And I call it a skeleton because I don't even think it counts as a pitch or an elevator. I don't even know what this is, but it's just issue 0, Return to the Hellfire Club. Issue 1, the post-apocalyptic arc. Oh, and also 2 and 3. Issue 4, the Black and White Ball. Issue 5 and 6, Space Race story. Issue 7 and 8, Suicide Town story. Issue 9, Cartney's Return of the Monster issue. Issue 10, 11, and 12, the final arc versus Cartney and the Cybernauts. And that was it. That was the entire written pitch for 12 issues of comics. But I was working with a publisher that had already hired me for the book because they thought I was the right fit. I was working with an editor who I had known for years, since before either of us worked professionally in comics. And I had gone to lunch with the editor, and we'd sort of talked about. So when I said Space Race story, he's like, okay, I know what he's saying there, or why he's picking that. And I also know the type of story I'm going to get from him with that. I know the type of thing I'm going to get from him when it says the Black and White Ball, because he's telling me about his inspirations and all that sort of stuff. So this is, again, when there's relationship, the format can be wildly different, and this is the most anemic pitch for 12 issues of comics I've ever seen, but it worked, and it became pretty much all the stories.
Yeah, that's awesome. By the way, can you move your cord a little bit? I'm getting a little bit of feedback on my end.
Yeah, it's because I'm in London. I'm using a converter.
Oh, there, it's gone. You solved it.
Yeah, I unplugged it. I've got enough battery now. I should be able to last for a little while.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, these are really, really, really helpful because, like you're saying, and like we've both been saying this whole time, pitches come in so many different formats in so many different ways that this is why you need to know your audience. This is why you need to
understand what it is you're trying to accomplish and what your publisher or your producer is trying to accomplish. If you don't understand those things, then you're never going to be able to come to the table with something that's interesting. But if you already know what you need to come to the table with, you can literally do your skeleton and still it's a successful pitch, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I really like the examples. Thanks for going through that.
That was a project where basically they're like, you know what, this is weird in a way that fits Caleb. So I was asked to come do this book because it was weird in a way that fit me. They thought I would be good for that.
Right.
And so there was so much that I didn't need to pitch because that already existed in the project. They're like, we see why you're right for this project. So I didn't need to pitch that because they had done that. They pitched the book to me originally. They're like, hey, do you want to do this? But now I was pitching the series of events essentially. And again, I was using like 3 words to describe 2 issues, just saying, because the book was set in 1969, or 1967 and 68. So I'm like, hey, it was the middle of the space race. So we got to do a space race story because it's a spy-fi book. Yeah. And 1967 is the famous black and white ball. So I want to riff on that because it's an incredible visual. This room of famous people all wearing nothing but black and white. And, so like these sort of things, or just like, oh, here's a news story that I thought was really interesting about suicides in a town in the UK. So I'm going to turn that into a story. And, but again, they knew they were going to get because we had a relationship. So, and finally, one other example I'll give you, there's nothing written on this, but this is the first time I was hired to write a screenplay. And my college roommate had somehow stumbled backwards into being the junior producer on this, teen slasher film. He was never a producer on anything else before that or ever again. So going back to, it's like, there's just this weird anomaly where for a minute my college roommate was involved in producing a teen slasher film, and they needed someone to rewrite it. And he's like, I know somebody. That's cool. Called me and set up we're going to have sort of, it was like drinks basically with the more senior producer the next day. I didn't have a copy of the script and he didn't have one he could send me. So he basically verbally on the phone gave me a 5 to 10 minute summary. Like, here's the story. And come tomorrow and meet the producer who's going to be making the final decision. So I went there with that. Like, I had some ideas, but I thought it was just a meet and greet. Essentially, I thought it was basically them seeing, and we're hanging out, we're having drinks and some appetizers. And there was 1 2-minute part of the conversation where we actually talked about the project. Everything else, people talking, hanging out, sharing weird stories, car crashes, and all sorts of strange things. But there was one point where the senior producer turned to me and he's like, so he told you about the project. What do you think? And that was it. And I had thought about it a little bit. I did not have a really deep take on it because I had just last night been given a verbal summary of the whole thing. And so I just reversed the idea because I had never seen the inverse of this idea. I had seen this idea executed in similar ways, but I had never seen the inverse. So I said, well, what if we just flipped it? What if this instead of this? And that was the entire pitch. And they hired me to do it. Yeah. The project never got made, but that was the sample that went to Drew, and that got me the job on Mongolian Connection, which is a project that did get made, and you can listen to our episode talking about that. But just to show you like how little that entire process, and I had no track record. I had written no movies, but the junior producer knew me and vouched for me. Yep. And I did have published credits in comics. And that was enough. They were like, well, okay, can probably pull it off. Yeah. But so there was almost no story information in that entire thing. The entire process, the whole thing took 2 minutes out of just a regular drinks and appetizers type of thing. Right. And there was almost no specific details about the story in there. It was just, what if we flipped it?
I've got an idea. Yeah. That's cool. And
it worked. And And that's an example of something where I said sometimes the idea is enough, because I have since then sort of pitched that idea to some other people. And every time, some of them professional editors, they're like, we should make that, because it's just not a take on that many people have seen. So in that case, it was enough. Yeah. You know, if I had given him an execution dependent pitch, that may not have worked. But luckily, everything aligned. I had a way to do it. Now, of course, because this was a job to rewrite a pre-existing script, by flipping it, I kind of worked myself into a corner, because it meant I couldn't use any of the script I was technically rewriting. Because I had to essentially start over from scratch. So
you created more work for yourself.
Yes, I gave myself a lot more work, but you know, it all came together. And so with all of those pitches, I also just want to point out how many of them were relational.
Yeah.
So one is meant for a publisher who's not on board yet. One was meant for readers, but two of them were pitches for licensors where publisher had already said, this is the guy to write this book. Right. One is for a publisher, an editor I had a relationship with. Like, it wasn't a specific invitation, but another one was a specific, will you pitch us ideas?
Yeah.
One was, you know, do you have a take on this treatment? Tell us your take. And one was, you've got this job, like, what are you going to do with the next 8 issues, sort of thing. And then one was, like I said, the junior producer knew me. And that carried enough weight that they were willing to take a shot with me, even though I had no screenwriting experience at that point. So much relationship involved in pitching. And you'll notice none of them look the same. None of them are the same length. None of them have the same type of information. Mm-hmm. It depended on what was being pitched, is what they looked like. And it depended who they were being pitched to and what sort of history there was there and all of that. So.
And if you were to break down all of your pitches, all of the conversations that we've had, if you were to say, what are 3 elements that must be present in any pitch, you've basically described relationship. You need to have the relationships with the people to be even in the meetings. You have to have some level of authority. Your level of authority, it needs to be different depending on who you're pitching to and what their needs are. And you have to have a concept. And if you have those 3 things, that may be the only 3 things you need to get your pitch sold effectively, right? So I really like that. I like the way that you've addressed that.
Basically, friends, competency, and ideas.
Exactly.
And that's not a complicated formula on paper, but so many people get hung up on that because they're trying to have relationships that are based on a goal or something that benefit them, and they're trying to do a specific type of pitch. Like I you know, the example, I Googled Aaron Sorkin pitches, so all my pitches look like that. And no matter what I'm pitching and no matter who I'm pitching it to, and then also part of what you're showing is that you've got lots of ideas, because of all those pitches, over half of them didn't go.
Yeah.
Like, and so even when you're getting paid and you're getting the job, you're throwing ideas out, and people are like, no, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. And so if you think that selling a story is just yeses, or that once you've sold one, from that point on, you can just say, here's what I want to do, and people will say yes. There's still more no's than yeses in the writing life. There's still plenty of rejection, but it's rejection of ideas. It's, you know, they're like, that's not going to work, but we like you, we'll work on something else, you know.
We should do our next, we should do our
over, because that's not going to work, but we still think you're the right person, so just start over, you know.
We should do our next podcast in 2 weeks from today. Our next podcast should be on rejection, because we're going to talk Justice League. We're going to talk about all that stuff and writing and how that all works. But we should talk. Rejection is a really, really interesting, rejection and or failure are really interesting topics, I think, for writers to marinate on a little bit more.
That may need its own episode. So we may need to do it instead of trying to share the topic with the Justice League. We're going to talk.
Oh, no. Yeah, I totally agree. It should be its own episode. Like
in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks.
2 episodes. We should definitely do that.
Yes. Absolutely. But one more thing I want to say that is just basically putting a point on what you're saying is that one of the things we talk about a lot when we talk about whether or not something is successful or whether or not it fails or whatever is we talk about the luck quotient. There is a luck quotient to these things.
And one of the most important things is that people try to hit the luck quotient, but they don't operate on those 3 pillars in order to make their own luck. What do I mean by that? You can't shortcut the friendship thing. You actually have to make the friendships. Like if you're going to put your work into anything, it's don't network, friendship, right? Like you have to put the work in. If you're going to get lucky and be introduced to somebody because of something else, that is luck, but you put in the work of making friendships.
Make friends with people that you want to know for the rest of your life, because most of your friends are not going to help you get a project made or sold. Right. But you will have a friend for your whole life, and that's worth more than any project ever.
Exactly.
Someone who will be with you through thick and thin. You'll see them raise their kids. You'll have dinners together. Trips together, like that. That is winning life.
Yeah.
We'll do that. Yeah. And maybe the project's not going to work, or maybe they're never going to help you with a project, but that's invaluable. Don't trade that for anything.
Yeah, and so that one's the relationship one, right? Like don't shortcut your relationships. The other 2, when we talk about authority and when we talk about concepts, that's don't shortcut the work, right? You got to put in the work. You will never have any authority unless you do work. And a certain amount of work will benefit you in some ways. Luck will come in and you'll win a contest. You'll place in the top 10 in a contest. You'll do whatever. And then finally, you got to keep coming up with ideas and putting them on paper. And if you put in the work in those 3 areas, the luck quotient increases exponentially as you do that. So yes, everyone's going to need to get a little bit lucky here and there, but you got to put in the work for the luck to work. Otherwise, no one gets famous just based purely off luck. And I don't mean famous like in the context of fame, but I mean it in the context of success.
Right. And luck as a concept, it really doesn't exist. It's a word that we use to describe just opportunities meeting possibilities or meeting preparedness. So it's probability. That's all it is. And the more people you know and the more stuff you write and the better you are at it, the more probable it is
right.
one of them is going to happen.
Exactly.
And so it's a numbers game. You write 100 things, maybe only one of them will be the one that sells, but you got to get through all the others to get to that one. Exactly. And the longer you do it, the better you get at it, and the more frequent, or you start making relationships. And so you're instead of 1 out of every 100, you're 1 out of every 20 is landing, or what have you. And I will say one thing that we didn't talk about, and I should throw this out as a type of competency, because really you're showing, hey, I'm competent to tell this story.
Right.
When we talk about authority or different words we use for that, craft, skill.
Sure.
Part of your competency is showing that you know what not to put in the pitch.
Yeah.
Like we don't need to talk about that because I know you know that.
Yes, exactly.
I don't need to explain to you something I know that you know, or I just know what's important here.
Right.
And those details are not as important as the tone. They're not as important as the theme. They're not as important as the character. So I'm leaving out details because I know that these are the most crucial things. Now, I'm not saying that I did that extremely well, because who knows? Sometimes I was probably being given grace because they knew me and knew that I could execute well. They're like, maybe it wasn't their favorite pitch, but they're like, that's okay. We think we'll get a good script from him.
Right.
I'm not seeing all of that. So I'm not saying that they were perfect pitches. In fact, I'm almost sure that they weren't, because there is always a relational aspect where people can see past just the words on the page. There's something else going on. But a big part of competency is that you know what not to say or what not to describe, to put in there.
Excellent. Love it.
Yeah. Hilarity ensues, describing most of the comic.
Right. Exactly. So that is all fantastic. I think we've covered pitching pretty well at this point in time, but if you have any questions for us in regards to pitching, feel free and leave us a comment either on YouTube or on Podbean or wherever else you find us. Any final thoughts, Caleb? We're going to get into, like we talked about, some Justice League. We'll talk about rejection and failure. That'll be a really interesting topic. But anything else you want to cover with pitching before we close out?
I think I'm tapped. I think I probably said too much. So,
well, you and me both. But I appreciate having you on the show. And that is it for today's show. So don't forget to subscribe to the Story Geeks Podcast, either here on YouTube as we record live or on your preferred podcast provider. Look for the Story Geeks Podcast. If you want to chat more about pitching or about stories with the rest of the Story Geeks crew, go over to the Story Geeks Facebook group. If you're looking for a new story to read, watch, or listen to, check out Death of a Bounty Hunter, the book I co-wrote, or The Mongolian Connection, the film Caleb co-wrote. We appreciate you supporting us in checking those out. And then special thanks to all of our monthly supporters. Here are the awesome supporters who donate to us through Patreon. Zach Linton, the No Midnight Podcast, Sean R. Reed, Anthony Holder, Ray DeLeon, Joshua Beckham, Brianna, Bryce Cox, Young Money, Savvy, Adam Vargas, Mary Baldwin, Wade Johnson, Jim Baldwin, Kimberly Lugeau, Monty Thigpen, Nick Prokop, and Connie Moe. Please consider supporting us, even if it's only a couple dollars a month. And know that our supporters now get to hang out with the Story Geeks team in the Story Geeks Hangouts every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Pacific time. Learn more at thestorygeeks.com. And that's where you can also support us, is heading over to thestorygeeks.com. So on behalf of Caleb and me, good luck with your pitching. Build your relationships, build your credibility, and come up with some awesome ideas. And we will see you guys on the next show. Bye.
Bye.